Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are all full-stomached and Thanksgivinged out, and so you know, one of the things that is interesting on the show that we're always trying to figure out is, what do you guys like? What do you dislike? And we've had a couple of shows recently. You know, Aaron and I have kind of gone back and forth on where are we in the DevOps camp? Are we pro-DevOps? Are we anti-DevOps? And we've done a couple of shows lately where, you know, DevOps was one of the topics, and it got a lot of attention. Now, I don't know if that was positive attention or negative attention. So in order for us to sort of sort through some of this, we sent our chief DevOps correspondent out to DevOps Enterprise Summit a couple of weeks ago, week and a half ago or so. And so Josh Atwell, welcome back to the show, first off.
Thank you very much. There for a second, I had hoped that your feedback was everybody loved me on a previous episode, and then you just had to have me back.
They did. The show that we had you on as when we were at All Things Open, when you were co-hosting, and we talked to Chris Short from SolarWinds about sort of, you know, DevOps from the front line. A lot of listens, maybe, you know, 20-30% more than the average. So I assume that's a good thing. But I'm always curious because I there's a part of me that you know, looks at DevOps and goes, you know, it is a human behavioral change thing, and that's hard. And then there's a part of it that's, you know, that's technology, and that's hard too, but maybe not always as hard. And so I had a chance to go to DevOps Enterprise Summit 2 years ago. I didn't get a chance to go this year because I was at KubeCon, but you had a chance to go. So first off, give me your take. You hadn't been there before, had you?
I had actually gone to the DevOps Enterprise Summit earlier this year in London.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
So I had been at a DevOps Enterprise Summit, but just not in the U.S. Okay.
So give us two perspectives then. Give us the the U.S. version perspective, and then maybe compare the two.
Yeah. You know, it's an interesting event. One thing that I found having attended a lot of these events is that there is this real hunger for knowledge. And, you know, Gene Kim and the IT Revolution team, they do a really nice job of curating a lot of people who are, you know, thought leaders and executioners, if you will, not like in the you know, ending a life, but, you know, actually deploying DevOps successfully and reaping the benefits. You know, they do a really good job of bringing these people together and allowing them to kind of share their journey and some of the things that have happened and how they've, you know, adopted DevOps and how they implemented it. One of the interesting things that a lot of people saw in the one in the U.S. was talking about how the American Airlines merger, you know, they had some leadership from the IT organizations there talking about some of the challenges there. Now, you know, I'm not a fan of those airlines, but I was really, you know, intrigued by like their tale about, you know, how they were kind of tackling that. So you get a little bit of that, and then, you know, on the other end of the spectrum, they had like Adrian Cockcroft from Amazon, AWS, and, you know, he was talking about building teams and how different organizations approach bringing in talent and managing talent and growing people within the organization. So nice little blend across the board. And I would say there's a lot of consistency from the UK event and the US event from that standpoint. There were some of the same presenters who presented I would say similar talks. Some of them were a lot of overlap, which that's fine. I can appreciate. But yeah, that was a lot of commonality between the two.
Okay, well, cool. So the thing I liked about the show when I went a couple years ago was, it felt very, I don't know, living out here in Raleigh. You know, we always sort of say, hey, we have a little different perspective than the Silicon Valley perspective. And it felt like it was sort of the DevOps show for the rest of the world, right? Sort of the non-unicorn show, because the people who were presenting the you know, stories that were being presented were things like, at least when I went, it was you know, Nationwide Insurance, it was Sherwin-Williams Paint, it was some people from the U.S. federal government. It was, you know, it wasn't people whose only asset, the thing they delivered was a technology. What did you see this year? What were some of the good stories that you heard, or what were some of the things that you saw evolve?
Yeah, I think you touch on something that's very true in that a lot of the people that are there are not people that you would necessarily look at and say, this is absolutely a high technology company.
Right.
At the one in London, I think one of the big ones that stood out for me was Barclays Bank. And they were talking about how old they were. And, I make the joke around this that some of their policies are literally written into stone. Right? They've just been around so long. But the fact that they were recognizing the disruption that their business had, how they were having to be more of a software company and interacting with consumers through software and through the devices that they had and changing the online experience, how that's a new evolution for a lot of these companies. And I think you're spot on. In fact, Nationwide was one of the companies that presented in the one in London. They were talking about how they're making their services more portable and looking at the 12-factor apps and how they are enabling their developers to turn on specific features that they need specifically for the application that they have and be able to create ad hoc environments and putting these ad hoc services together. So that was kind of interesting. And my understanding is they've continued to have an evolution. And one of the things that I'm looking forward to going forward is seeing hopefully some of these companies come back, maybe not next year, but the year after, to talk about how they continue that evolution and tackling new things. And I think given that so many people are across a spectrum of adoption with DevOps, this event does a pretty good job of highlighting some of those things.
Yeah. What did you see? One of the things that I think we all sort of struggle with some of the DevOps stuff, and again, you could sort of substitute the word DevOps with some of these digital transformations and just journey, and they're all evolutionary types of things. Have you seen any sort of models emerge yet that you're seeing people repetitively talking about, or especially on the people side of things? I hear a lot of stories about, well, we built a center of excellence, or this was done out of the CTO's office, but I'm curious if you've seen any organizational models yet that you are starting to see some consistency in terms of people saying, this is a thing that works.
Yeah, I would say I see two primary things, and one kind of begets the other. One is that a lot of the organizations that are on stage and presenting and talking about their journey, and this is both at the DevOps Enterprise Summit, and I've seen this at the DevOps Days events as well, is that they have embedded people across different organizations. So they'll take actual operations folks and have them interacting with the development teams on a regular basis, kind of as a liaison, or actually embedded with them to help get more visibility into what's happening on the development side, understanding what's coming, what the challenges were, the last deploy, what went wrong, maybe how can operations improve that, and then allowing the operations folks to report in about, well, this was absolute crap. This should have been handled a little bit better. This is how we can do this a little bit more effectively. And then the other thing that I've noticed most recently, especially at the San Francisco event, was a much greater increase on the discussion of insourcing and bringing development expertise back in-house. No longer going out overseas and outsourcing certain components of the development, but by bringing it back in-house, having a lot more ownership, not just from the code that's developed, but the pace at which it's being developed, and being able to pivot when needed instead of having to renegotiate the agreement that they have with the outsourcer. They can just pivot those people and put them on other things. And so part of those two together, they were discussing frequently about how they could take a single person and potentially move them from one team to the other, and it being non-disruptive. This kind of led directly into Microsoft's talk when they were talking about how they're implementing Git throughout the entire company. And the success of that, in part, enabled more developers to be able to transition from one team to another without as much disruption as they have had from the past. Now, I don't believe that was one of their core motivators per se, but it absolutely provided a lot more flexibility from a resource perspective. So now you can treat each one of those resources as someone that can be deposited into a small team for tackling a specific application, or can be moved over to another group to help fix some backlog and to get them caught up with where they should be. I think that was probably the biggest theme that I've seen so far this year, and was specifically highlighted at the DevOps Enterprise Summit.
Yeah, no, it brings up a couple of interesting points. I think for any of us that have gone through seeing development, whether it's dev or test, get outsourced or offshored, it does create some interesting problems, right? The first one is it creates typically a time zone barrier, which is, in and of itself, typically a huge problem. Somebody's on a call at 1 a.m, or somebody's on a call at very late hours of the night. You introduce, some sort of communication channel, which, for one-to-one, like we're doing right here, not such a big deal. When you have rooms of people, having to communicate over it makes it very difficult. And like you said, if you're introducing an outsourcer and the outsourcer's motivation is, to do things like charge you for changes and to stick to scopes of work, and you're trying to introduce a model that changes a lot. And it does make a lot of sense that we're seeing this, this push towards kind of repatriatizing the work, bringing people back, bringing, the projects back and so forth. Did you see any people who were successfully doing that, but still having remote workers, say like here in the States, or was, that embedding meaning, physical location, or did that come up at all?
I don't recall it being specifically outlined, but the general intent, for instance, if you look at, and they weren't there, but if you look at Walmart, Walmart has developers in different geos around the country.
Right.
And, that's kind of well known that they have a big presence in Silicon Valley area. Even though they're an Arkansas-based company, they have folks in New England as well who work on different elements and develop there. So I don't see that the geographies are as important per se in this, especially with the way that people are working and the way that they're being organized into teams. But I think the intent really more is on having more control over what people are working on at any given point in time and being able to modify that. That to your point, like if your statement of work says that you're going to deliver X, Y, Z and any changes are going to cost you, and it's not just the money that's going to cost you, it's going to cost you time, because now you're going to have to work through renegotiating what that statement of work is, what those deliveries are. And if you're an organization that's not equipped for that, then that's going to create some issues for sure. That is definitely not the DevOps methodology, if you will.
Right. What did you see? There's always a people aspect of, reorganize the team, retrain people. Did you find there were any other sort of commonality in terms of things that were working? A lot of times you'll hear people say, well, the first thing we need to do is get a sort of automated test CI pipeline in place, or we just need to learn how to automate stuff, whether it's infrastructure or whatever. Were there sort of first common themes or first common steps that people always kind of had to get over that, for the people that were successful, or is it still, was there much more focus on, instead of automation, kind of changing what the applications look like, whether they're strangler patterns or trying to break up monoliths into something else? Where was the focus? Was it more on automation? Was it more on rewriting applications, or was it something else?
I think it was mainly on two areas. Number one being how to build more of a service-oriented model to where you're building components that can be leveraged throughout the organization. Target is a great example. They've recently talked a lot about how their inventory systems are API driven and can be accessed. They're accessed differently. It's the same system, but it's accessed by the web app. It's accessed by the in-store systems. It's a central service that is provided for the development of other applications. A lot of focus I see on that. GE also has a great white paper out. I think it's a white paper, a couple blog posts talking about how they're doing the exact same thing with the work that they're doing. So I'm seeing that quite a bit. Capital One also talked a little bit about that with at the event, where basically everyone who's writing code, they're very much open to open source. They're brought a lot of it back in, and they work in product teams, right? So in a product team, they'll have the developers, they'll have a product manager, if you will. They'll have some folks that are associated with operations. They'll have folks that are associated with testing, and all of these people get together to work on a specific product and to move that segment forward. And those people could mix and match, right? They could be moved and broken up and worked on another product team. So enabling the people to kind of get together, a small group. I think the way a lot of people like to describe that, the two pizza teams, have a team no bigger than what two pizzas can feed. And I guess that would depend on how much pizza people eat, but the concept remains, right. Keeping the teams small and enabling them to do everything that they need to do, and that hits on the second thing that I think is a common thread of transparency and collaboration. No longer trying to hold everything to the chest and being very transparent about what you did and how things work and what needs to happen. Being very clear in your communication about what your expectations are and what your needs are, rather than saying, well, we could do that, but it would be very, very difficult. So we don't want to tell them that we could do that because then we would actually have to do it. But be more in line with, well, yes, that's possible. It's going to take this amount of time, this number of resources. This is how challenging it's going to be. We would need people from your team to get on board and help out. But yeah, we could do it. And then, having a little more visibility and to when things are actually happening. This is going to deploy at this point in time. It's not going to be a surprise. We've been communicating, we've been involved. And I think that structure of embedding resources or doing those product teams, as I mentioned with Capital One, I think that's part of that desire, right? Because now you don't have these strong lines of delineation from the different disciplines. Now you're required more or less to sit right next to these folks and engage with them on a regular basis and work together as a team in order to be successful.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I know that the Target folks have done always, they've been very good about presenting out there. They've done a very good job of really talking about their evolution. They buy into the sort of dojo, embedded model where you've got a group of people that kind of went out, were pioneers, established a new way of doing things. They've been bringing in groups to deal with different things. Come learn for 6-8 weeks, go back, take it back to wherever you're at, try and teach the teacher kind of thing. I'm curious though, if they dug into it at all. The concept of two pizzas sounds great. It fits on a t-shirt. It fits on a slide. The trick to that is, it's sort of just like microservices. It sounds great in theory, right? Small, fix it. But it does introduce a bunch of overhead in terms of, I've now got to, sort of like you said, I've got to document what I'm doing because I'm going to present what I'm doing as an API. I've got to coordinate a roadmap with people. I've got to communicate schedules. I've got to do a bunch of things that, I'm curious, did anybody ever get into how much project management overhead or how much just communication overhead goes on when you start breaking things up into these much smaller teams? And how well that's worked or what hasn't worked and so forth. Because again, you're introducing a human element into something that, when if they're not all aligned in terms of what their priorities are or what their motivations are, can potentially become challenging.
Yeah, and I think you touch on something that is still a challenge at a lot of these events, and that some of those things are glossed over pretty well. They don't get into a lot of the depth. Some of the talks, they'll get into a lot of where those challenges were. And there was one talk I saw, I think it was in Detroit recently, where they talked about the trough of disillusionment, where you hit this point where it's a lot more painful going down the DevOps path, because now you're deploying more frequently, you're seeing more of the wounds that are in the environment, you're having more failures up front that you're trying to address and get out of the way. I think Jez Humble has a quote that puts it best: "If it hurts, do it more frequently, and then bring the pain forward." And so, there's a lot of that, but I think that a lot of the talks that you see at these events really kind of gloss over some of that pain. Yeah. They don't get into a lot of the specifics or show off some of the warts. Not that I think that they're trying to hide them, but when you're trying to condense your talk, I think you're trying to motivate people, and some of this stuff can be really disheartening.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I know my feeling when I went out to the event, so you can go to a DevOps Days event and to a certain extent you sort of realize it's as much a networking event as it is an education event. Somebody's wanting to say like, look, I did something, and you know what? If somebody else is willing to pay me more, I'm willing to go do that at your company too, which is cool, like free markets. The sense I got at the Enterprise Summit event was more, especially when you were, say take somebody like Nationwide, who's I think in Columbus, Ohio. You go, look, these folks aren't looking to jump a bunch of jobs. It's not like there's a massive market in Columbus, Ohio for, high tech companies per se, right? But they do have a ton of really stable, long-term like retail companies and other stuff. And you go, these folks, like 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, like isn't a long period of time, because they look at their current employer as somewhere they want to stay for a long time, right? Like it's a different mentality. And I wonder if, they don't talk about it as much because they're like, look, it's just the pace of change that we deal with. And, I don't need to bring it up. It's painful. Whereas if you brought up 2-3 years to the folks in Silicon Valley, it's like, oh man, that's 3 jobs and 2 apartments and such, like, 4 stock options later, man, I wouldn't be dealing with that stuff. And, but you're right. You get a 30-40 minute talk, you're going to gloss over certain things. But I would like to see at some point, if Gene's folks are listening, which they probably aren't, but if they were, it would be nice to see a track about sort of DevOps at scale, as opposed to DevOps for Center of Excellence or DevOps for 10 microservices on the website type of thing. Because I think there is a certain amount of there is effort, if you will, or pain and suffering, as you said, like when you start to break these things up and then distribute them and deal with, just how do you run that going long term? How do you motivate people? How do you measure it? How do you manage it, and so forth?
Yeah, I would say also that Jason Cox from Disney, he had a great talk, and he did a very similar talk in London. It may have been almost all the same, and there was a lot of overlap. But in his talk, he actually talked about how they changed the org structure and some of the pain that was associated with it, and some of the I guess a lot of the higher level values in doing it, and then also some of the lower levels where they were almost along the same lines of creating those product teams, but those teams were basically spread across multiple properties within the Disney purview, to where these teams were supporting multiple elements with it. So the recording, I believe, was not done for his talk, just based on some of the negotiations with it being Disney and all, I believe. But there was a blog. I'll see if I can find it, and if we can, we'll put it in the show notes. Just kind of to outline some of that. There was definitely some images that were taken that were on Twitter. So if you search the DES 16 for the time frame in November, I'm confident that you'll see one of the org chart ones. But it was just really interesting how their VPs align, and how it's not just a like a tree org chart. It's very much more of a table where there's a lot of overlap on those. So yeah, there's definitely some of that.
Yeah, and I think and to your point, I think the model of saying like, look, the thing that we provide, looks like a service, and we can represent it as an API, and how we deal with things behind the covers, isn't necessarily as important. I mean, at some point to optimize it becomes important, but I think a lot of this stuff does sort of go back to the core principle of saying, look, it's sort of almost the reverse of Conway's law. It's like, look, the whole, like, your software will look like the way your organization communicates. Mm-hmm. Well, if you ever want your software to look the way it's supposed to look, you're going to have to sort of build your organization to communicate that way as well. And you almost have to start with the idea of, the thing that your group does needs to be represented as a service. It needs to be represented as a, programmable type of API. Kind of goes back to the old, Amazon.com internal memo of, you will be an API or you will be fired kind of thing. Yeah. Because I think otherwise, if you're trying to do them, loosely coupled, but in parallel, change your organization and then, write software a certain way, you're gonna kind of get a mess. I mean, you have to be very conscious of both the organizational model and the software development model, and that may allow you to scale just kind of with that thinking in mind.
Yeah, and I do think that is a big reason why you see organizations go in the model of having that center of excellence. Or, if you look at the DevOps report that Puppet and Dora put out earlier this year, one of the things that they mentioned is like 80% of workloads that are targeted for DevOps are net new workloads.
Yeah.
right? They're net new applications. And I think a large part of that is because, you can't develop the software and not have the people that are involved in mind and doing that, to your point. And so this gives them an opportunity to kind of incubate and work out all the warts. The way I like to describe, this scenario is that, you've got this spot out in a briar patch that you want to get to. You're going to get cut. You're going to bleed along the way. And the question is that as you do that, how do you prevent people coming behind you on the same path from getting cut and bleeding as much as you did? Because if you're going to do it and you want them to follow, the idea would be to kind of give them a safer path to get through.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it makes a ton of sense. And the last thing you want to do is look, every company, everybody says they want to become a software company. If you've ever lived in the software world, as soon as your software becomes like version 4.0, 5.0, 6.0, things aren't nearly as fun anymore because you're spending a lot of time, you get away from the sort of euphoria of I had this great idea and it's going to look exactly like this. And you get into the reality of this is how people want to use it. And it's going to look different than what you planned. And it's going to look different than how you architected it. And so, yeah, if you don't sort of put some of those rails up early on, you're going to have people that get very frustrated if they're not seeing sort of an ongoing ability to grow it and so forth. Let me ask you one more thing. So, every segment of our industry has some thing that people have talked about for a long time that sort of you go, God, I've heard this a million times, and I really kind of believe it's BS. We used to have things like, cloud bursting was a thing that people talked about, like it was going to happen when it never did. What are you seeing in the DevOps community that you sort of go, yeah, I wish they'd stop talking about that. I think that's complete BS.
Oh, wow.
Any DevOps pet peeve at this point that you kind of wish they would, you hear it over and over and you go, God, just stop doing that.
Well, I think for me, the biggest one is, and I think we're moving away from it, being that DevOps equals culture. And while I don't have a strong argument that culture isn't important in DevOps, I think that they've, as a community, we've kind of done a poor job of making culture being that flagpole that we're flying our flag on, when it's much more than that. I mean, without the culture, obviously it can't work long term. But culture is one of those things that are really, really hard. And I think DevOps is much broader than that. And so I think that's the one I'm personally looking at. I'm like, all right, let's stop talking about the culture and let's start talking about the how things get done. Because, if you start executing and getting things done and you start making people's life better, a couple of things happen. People get happier with their job. Even the DevOps report, talks about that. Like, people are more likely to recommend their company and they're more likely to stay at a company when DevOps has been implemented and they feel like they're accomplishing more. That changes your culture. So even if you're leading with a culture that does certain things, that as you get success with DevOps, you're going to change your culture. So culture can be a result of the work that you're doing. So
right.
I think that's the one I think is reducing the value in the conversation around DevOps.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think the thing that gets me about sort of the DevOps culture theme that goes on all the time is and I remember listening to like John O'Bacon, and we were at All Things Open and we were sitting in a side session and he was kind of talking about the culture and there was a piece of it that was like, yeah, I get it. Like you're trying to build this sort of harmony between, the pace at which developers are going to build things and the pace at which operations is capable of doing things. And inherently you create this, you have a friction there. You have a, impedance mismatch. You have a priorities sort of mismatch and so forth. But what, when I sort of take that and I overlay it on the DevOps Enterprise Summit sort of world, which, in reality, most of the folks that present there look like the bulk of the market. And if you sort of map out their journey, none of their journeys are short. I mean, they're all 2, 3, 4 years of effort and work. And, it takes a long time to make some of these big changes. And I always wonder from a culture perspective of, how are you going to evolve a culture when you sort of go, everything's blameless. We don't really, nobody's necessarily 100% accountable for something. And there's a part of me that goes, well, that's all cool. And that sounds great, except people would like to get promoted and they would like to get raises, and there are natural human power struggles that happen. And there are, it's almost like they go, well, we'd like to forget all those things that you just sort of learn, growing up and watching how things work, in the business world. So I think there's some sort of, there's a different balance that I think is going to have to sort of get struck there, especially as people are trying to figure out how do you do DevOps at bigger scale, as opposed to just, hey, here in this center of excellence where we all get to be superheroes and we all get to be cool and we all get to, be the person, the rock star that put out that first mobile application. Like, how are you going to deal with that at a broader scale? And I don't think that ever really gets talked about.
Well, interestingly enough, with Patrick Dubois, I had a conversation with him at the London DevOps Enterprise Summit. And when I was talking with him, I was like, so what kind of like moved you down this path to want DevOps to be in existence? And one of the things he mentioned, he's like, I just didn't want my job to suck as much as it did. And I kind of took that to heart. And so when I communicate out and I'm talking about like, what is DevOps? Like, when you boil it down, it's just making developing and deploying code suck less. And so from that standpoint, if you look at that, and you look at the things that you're doing to provide continual improvement throughout the system, the other thing that you should also be doing is removing heroics, right? That you no longer have these people who are doing these major feats of IT, if you will, in order to get to the finish line, and you're starting to create a much more predictable model for how things work, because you can't predict heroics. You just can't. You can't know that somebody's always going to step up and solve the problem. And they kind of touch on this in the Phoenix Project with Brent. Like, Brent's the character in the book who always knows everything, but he's also the bottleneck. He's also part of the problem. Like, things don't get fixed because everybody just assumes Brent can just jump in there and take care of it.
Right.
And with that, then it's not an environment where everybody's going to thrive and feel like they're getting what they should get, but everybody in the environment should feel like that they know what they're doing, what they're responsible for doing, and they can get it done in a somewhat less painful manner than they would have done otherwise. So I do think that we're going to see some shaking out there. I just saw an interesting tweet from Simon Wardley just prior to us starting this off, talking about how with IT organizations becoming more adept at being agile and changing what they're doing to modify to better present for what the business wants, they're starting to see a trend where the businesses are starting to demonstrate that they don't necessarily know what they want. They don't know where they want to go or what they want to do. And I think that's going to be an interesting thing, that if you start seeing these people who have I wouldn't say born in DevOps, but have been spending the last 3 to 5 years working in an organization that has been very efficient as an IT organization, they start looking to be promoted and moving to other companies to help kick those initiatives off at those other companies. Are the businesses even going to be ready for that? Or are they, you would hope that they're hiring someone like that because they are, but it'll be interesting to see if that actually continues to play out, where the businesses are now in a situation where they're like, so what can you guys do?
Right.
IT says, well, what do you want to do?
Right.
Business comes back.
And I think there's a part of that is, again, that is sort of, impedance mismatches where, business, people like to say that business moves extremely fast. I mean, to a certain extent, it does on a, if you're a rep who carries a day-to-day quarterly quota, life moves pretty fast all the time. But businesses, they do annual budgets, they do 5-year forecasts, they do 3, so I mean, like, IT has evolved sort of the way business has evolved. And now, like, they have an ability to go faster, and they're measuring themselves against other IT organizations, but they're not necessarily always measuring themselves against, how fast does everybody else in my business move? And so, yeah, you're going to have this sort of, natural impedance, correction between like the business saying, oh, we can go fast, huh? Well, what does that mean I have to start thinking about being able to do? Because before I was expecting you guys to tell me it was going to take 18 months. Now you want me to figure it out in a week? Oh, okay. I got to recalibrate my brain because I didn't used to have to worry about that problem.
Yeah, and it's a good problem. I almost liken it to when you're traveling with GPS now. Right? Yeah. You can go with Google or even some of the in-dash navigation systems where they will say, in fact, this happened to me yesterday. They'll say something along the lines like, "Traffic is stopped 2 miles ahead. Would you like to take an alternate route?" I'm like, well, yes, I would. Or it'll say, traffic stopped, but even with the delay, this is the fastest route, so just stick it out. I kind of look at businesses, and as these organizations are becoming more agile and more capable of delivering what's needed, when the business says, all right, look, to your point, we've got a 3-year plan for what we plan on doing and how we plan on attacking this market and growing it. But we see this one little opportunity that's a slight detour that we think is either going to get us there faster or is going to provide enough benefit that it's worth taking that alternate route. We're still going to the same destination, but we may just have an alternate route that's going to get us there. Can you navigate us through that and do it in a way that's not going to get us to our destination delayed or without all our baggage?
Right. Well, and that brings up the point of, and I'll sort of wrap it up on this. If you're an IT organization and you've actually gotten better, number one, kudos. But number two, you better start communicating that to people, because when that business opportunity comes along and they go, I wonder if we can do this, like they should have known ahead of time that you were capable of doing something on short notice. Right. It's the equivalent. It's the equivalent of your grocery store now being open 24 hours a day, where you go, oh, I can have that problem and just go to the grocery store and pick stuff up. And I say this, like people in Silicon Valley are going, what's the hell's the matter with you? You just Grubhub it and it just comes to your house. No, some of us actually still have to go to the grocery store, and it's nice that it's open 24 hours a day. But yeah, it gets back to sort of internal communication and internal marketing and, funny things like that you have to do to think about yourself as a business internally, as opposed to just an IT cost center and stuff.
Yeah, and I think what we're going to see most importantly with the growth of DevOps and with the growth of IT organizations being more effective in what they're doing and understanding the value that they have to the business. One of the things that I run into quite a bit, working for an infrastructure storage company, is that the capabilities of the storage system, like they have tremendous value outside of just the data management stuff that the storage team is accustomed to working with. And how do you understand a way to articulate the value that it has to the business and the additional services and capabilities that you can provide? And I think we're going to start seeing more and more IT organizations looking at themselves and saying, okay, this is the type of the service that we deliver. Here are the things that we can actually provide. And, would it be useful if you got this data like 8 hours faster? Or would it be useful if you could get this information from our customer base, using data sets that we already, helping it understand like the information and the systems that they provide, how they truly touch the business and the business looks to them to make money. I think we're going to see that continue to grow.
Yep. No, I agree, and I think it's another skill to add to the resume for folks, for the toolbox of get good at the stuff that you've got to do around DevOps for orgs and technology, and then also there's a communication element in there. So, listen, I'm going to wrap it up with that. You are very active out in a bunch of different communities, and rumor has it you may be starting your own podcast. Where can folks find you, stalk you, communicate with you, all those good things out on the internet?
Best place is always on Twitter at Josh_Atwell.
Okay, cool. Well, listen,
that's the easiest way.
All right, they can start there, and then you will help them find all the other ways to buy you a beer and pick your brain. Well, listen, man, it is great to have you back on the show. Hopefully, hopefully the holidays went well. I know we've got Thanksgiving behind us, but folks have got end of season holidays coming up, and we wish them all great holidays. Wish you guys good holidays. With that, we're going to wrap it up. And for Aaron and for Josh, folks, thanks for listening. We will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.